All right.
Right. Welcome to this second installment of Jeffersonville Township Public Library's Lift Every Voice programming, a celebration of African American poetry. Tonight, well, first of all, let me thank the Library of America for the generous funding that allows this program to happen. And also, let me introduce our speakers tonight. We have poet Mitchell L.H. Douglas, and Mr. Douglas is the author of several books, including Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms. I don't know if I can get this all in my screen here. And he is an award-winning poet. In fact, he, as of last week, I believe, was awarded yet another honor. And I have lost my place on my computer where I had saved it. Oh, yes. He is a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellow. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And also we have, oh, and I should mention he teaches at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. We also have with us Dr. David Anderson, who teaches in the English department at University of Louisville. And Dr. Anderson will take it from here.
Well, it's my distinct pleasure to both meet and introduce Professor Douglas, who has lived in Louisville, is the author of 3 books, as well as numerous other poems. Cooling Board, which is a poem that examines the life and experiences of the R&B singer Donny Hathaway. Black Alphabet, which in many ways is a deeply personal book of poetry about family history, the loss of your grandmother, but also very reflective of the connections between your own life and your parents' and grandparents' experiences. And the most recent book, Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms, which in many ways looks at both popular culture and contemporary violence. And in reflecting about our violent culture, and particularly its impact on African Americans themselves, what I'm going to ask Professor Douglas to do is go ahead and read several of his poems as part of a standard poetry reading. And then afterwards, I'll have some questions, but you should, while you listen, write questions and then eventually put them in chat, and we will try to get to as many as we possibly can. So I want to turn it over to Professor Douglas.
Dr. Anderson, thank you. Like I said, it's amazing to be with you all. It's amazing to meet you all and have this privilege of sharing poetry. It is Audre Lorde and Toni Morrison's birthday today.
Yeah.
Like of all days to read and share work, it's just like I feel like this is the perfect time to be doing that. So as you heard and thank you for that introduction as well. As you heard, I have 3 poetry collections. What I wanted to do tonight was share a little bit of each one, reading mostly from the new book, from the newest book, Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms, which Diane told you about. And I'm going to end with maybe some newer poems. It's interesting, when I wrote my first book about Donny Hathaway, which the strange thing about writing sometimes is this was not supposed to be my first book. My first book was supposed to be the poems in Black Alphabet, but I kind of held on to one manuscript, kept working on another, and Black Alphabet came a very different book when my grandmother passed, and thinking about the way it changed my family. So with Cooling Board, a long playing poem. And this has artwork by Crystal Franklin, the artwork that's behind me on the cover. I wanted to have Black art be a large part of these collections as well. So I'm going to share with you one poem from Cooling Board, written totally in persona. So I'm writing as Donny Hathaway, and this is a poem where he's examining his piano, and it's called Anatomy. Call it a great wood wing, ebony sail for a vessel anchored in pine. Its curve can pass for a spine, dip of dark, an invitation to hammered timber, a sound that can't be bartered. Music is always, Grandma said, when she parted my scalp, hot with the tug of her heavy hand. Cool blue pomade quelled the fire until the next pull, the next match strike of the steel-toothed rake, her seasoned fingers. Call it irrigation. Grandma cut paths in fields of black cotton, giving back a love like the piano, black well of sound. Its night and day fingers anticipating the reach of mine. Tell me that's not my body in tone and touch, that both of us don't break, bleed. So that's a little Donny Hathaway. Now I want to transition to Black Alphabet, my second book. And this has a painting by my uncle, John Green, from Louisville, who went to Rhode Island School of Design. And again, this is just going with my kind of focus on wanting kind of unique Black art on each book cover. Also weird that I'm demanding book covers. Like, people don't talk about that, right? Like from the first book, I'm like, no, we're gonna do this. Like, yeah, I actually did that. I don't know why I thought I was gonna get away with that. This second poem is kind of an explanation of how I got to even be a fan of Donny Hathaway. I had the best uncle, James Green. He passed a few years ago. He's no longer with us, my mother's younger brother. But he played the best music, like, all the time. So when I was in the car with him, he's always playing classic, these classic soul songs. Donny was one of those, and Al Green was another, and he would sing some Al Green to you in a second. So this is called Al Green Was a Preacher. Al Green was a preacher before he was a pastor. Let me explain. If you can't find a sermon in love and happiness, something's wrong. He slides from one strange world to the next, like Uncle Jimmy navigating his sky blue cougar down West Market. Al testifies and we glide past the coffee cup where we ate greasy burgers in white paper, the ring and sugar of onions steamed inside. Past Jay's, where Mama bought my first black Chuck Taylors for first grade. Past the Cavalier Inn, a bar only a biker could love, peeling paint and look away faces. Past the laundromat where Daddy George washed our clothes in big chrome troughs that ate our change, bleached our robes. Al would know this world, would sing of the corner's jet to meet you, the pain of the angle, how one street runs right into the next, no one raising eyebrows. We ride deeper west, rising out of our seats and settling back to the cushions with each pock in the road. Past St. Columba, where I bloodied Jay's nose in the lunch line. Best friend, how many times can I say I'm sorry? Past Shawnee, where Mama, Aunt Sissy, and Uncle Jimmy said high school is not enough. Past empty knee-high bottles, bodies of cigarettes bent in gutters, what smoldered in the grip of unknown lips, discarded for other pleasures. Many a lesson waits on our streets, like how to catch lightning bugs in mayonnaise jars, how to poke holes in lids to let trophies breathe, how to balance your weight on two bicycle wheels, never fall, ride like the unfettered skip of your heart. So you can see how much you might have recognized some things in Louisville in that poem. There's old things and new things, right, in Louisville. But I wanted to make it clear as your, oh my goodness, thank you for that comment. That's wonderful. You're riding into the West, deeper into the West End in that poem, and that was my intent. Where pretty much, you know, for me, lessons as a poet began. So I want to share poems now from Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms. This is my second book with Percy, and my third book. This one has artwork from Derek Adams. Dr. Anderson's explanation, I think, was just so kind of on point with this idea of, you know, this book comes out in 2018. You know that based on when that's published, that's right in the center of a very kind of tough time for our country. And I'm trying to figure a lot of things out in terms of, you know, the incidents of violence I'm seeing in Indianapolis remind me so much of Louisville. You know, these kind of mirror things and the conversations we're having, you know, I was having with family. So I wanted to write a book that addressed some of these concerns. This first poem I'm going to read begins with an epigraph from Robert Hayden. And this poem is called Circle. It takes place on the Circle in Indianapolis. Circle. And the road twisted onto his loveless house and his cornfield dying in the scarecrow's arms. Robert Hayden. Today the sun has fists, not rays. Nothing delicate happens here. Watch the beating that goes ignored, the circle, evening, the monument and call of war, a common Indiana ranch with the roof ripped off. Baruch says the Midwest is sieve, pass through, permanently in transit, flux. It is the get here to get there, the sun's map fist and an orange 6 o'clock beatdown, the tenants strewn about the concrete circumference, liquid in states of rest. Skin and bone poured over the curb of South Meridian, splayed beneath a mailbox propped against a garbage can outside. The suits and walkers' heads turn, sidestepping the future they escaped, eyes on a latte, the next block. Today has a better haymaker, a better uppercut, a wicked right-left combo. Today the sun is perfecting its roundhouse and its side 14 keeps connecting. Left jaw, right jaw, you would cry, but there's no layaway for tears. So you cuddle up on an asphalt couch next to your brothers and sisters, the styrofoam maracas of cups and change, lulling you to rest like the pluck of kalimbas and turning signals. The bass lines, car horns hang in exhaust, cruising through your living room on an airless city night. So I wanted to get that early in the poem, early in the book rather, this idea of the center of the city and who was there. You know, if you hear sometimes about Indianapolis, you know about our sports, right? We have these really strange conversations about, you know, moving the homeless people out of the way so the people downtown can enjoy themselves. You know, there's too many homeless people on the circle, or, you know, asking for change, and then there's rules made about that. You know, so it's kind of like we're talking about the wrong problem, you know, a lot of times. And I kind of felt like I was like, we were in their space when I was there with my students writing. And that was something I wanted to touch on. This book has several series of poems. Has anybody ever been to Half Price Books and you find a book that's been signed, which is like one of the things for me, it's just like, you know, because, you know, when you see people, you know, oh my God, okay, I really love the chat and just, this is like the good stuff that happens in a workshop, that you're commenting on the lines. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. So sometimes when I'm in a Half Price Books and I'm trying to save a little bit of money on a book, I might see a book that somebody I know bought and signed, and they got signed and sold back. So sometimes I rescue the book. Sometimes it kind of led to a series. So this poem is called Abandon, and it begins with the epigraph 1/21/2011, Lyrae Van Cleef Stephanon, and her signature is crossed out. For Debbie, joy and blessings, inscription in open interval. Debbie is not open to poetry. Her friend is mistaken. She takes the gift with a smile, promises to read every line her friend suggests. Andromeda, Ithaca, good so far. She is wrong. She does like poetry. So does he. They meet when Debbie opens interval at a campus coffee shop, the one where the long line should warrant better brew. She nods, feigns interest in this story of an MFA, wanting to be a professor, an author. It's nice and all, but can't he see she's reading? And anyway, who goes in on career goals 5 minutes after hello? What would Lyrae say? Sitting with Matisse, unpacking flesh and outline. Well, something about him said Matisse, not the man, the process, his fade and focus like pink nude, abstract, realist, abstract, realist, before settling on the weathered hip. What words would a poet string to spit shine soft pickup lines? Debbie sinks into the pages, leaves in such a spark, the book is abandoned. He attempts to read the poems, wonders if he can be an author after all, swears he will give Debbie the book back the next time he sees her, sells it for cash instead. So it's kind of funny what happens when you find these books, because immediately I'm thinking, what is the story? Like, how did this book get there? Also, I'm really disappointed in the people I know that sell the books back more times than not. I'm just like, oh, this is bad. I should tell on you. Should tell everybody. I'm not going to shame people like that. At least not yet. You know what I just thought about? Do you want to take a break and talk a little bit and then read some more, or should I read a few more poems? How do you want to do this?
Either way, well, maybe I could start with a question, and I'm kind of looking in chat just in case, and then we can probably move along. And well, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. Maybe we could start with Circle and dying in the scarecrow's arms first. And one thing that comes to mind, I'm not trying to be pretentious here. I'm trying to get to the point. My wife tells me, get to the point. So I'm trying to learn to get to the point. And place and where one belongs, a sense of belonging seems to be very central to your work. And in particular, where African Americans find themselves, they're claiming of space, they're claiming of history. And I guess Why does that come up so much in your work?
I think one, because I moved around quite a bit as a kid.
Okay.
So I'm from Louisville, West End. Dad goes into the PhD program in Iowa. So we moved to Iowa City, which is so different. Very few Black people. I felt like we knew all the Black people in town, like they all were at the school with him. Once he gets his PhD, we moved to Columbus, Ohio. He works at, has a job at OU at Athens, Ohio University in Athens, which is even smaller than Iowa City. And then we finally come back to Louisville. So I was always trying to figure out where I fit in these places, like all the time. The first move, you know, eventually it became easier. The move to Iowa was very difficult. And it's, you know, the way things go, I was not comfortable there until the year we left.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I was just like, you know, I'm 13 now. I've got all these good friends. We figured out, I'm other people that, you know, I'm basically hanging out with, you know, I don't fit in. I've been bullied, you know, for being Black or, you know, or being younger than other kids or whatever. Find these punk rock kids. Punk for me is this creates this community and belonging. So a lot of times I figured out how to belong with music. And that's where that comes from. And that idea of I'm always thinking about the space. Of course, moving Columbus was difficult. I was in Columbus. I didn't know this until years later. I was in Columbus when the crack era just started.
Yeah. Okay.
And I didn't find that out till later. And this is like, oh, this is why Columbus is so violent. Okay. I'm moving in, and there's a kid that gets killed at the community center, like 2 blocks from me. That's another poem in Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms. It's like that's my introduction to Columbus. Is there's actually gangs here. I never would have guessed that. And there's violence, right? So by the time I get back to Louisville, I'm, you know, kind of figuring out I'm much more comfortable. And then going off to college, there's the Affrilachian Poets. Okay. So with the Affrilachian Poets, you know, friends who just happen to write poetry without a name first, we kind of get into this thing where, you know, Frank creates this word Affrilachian, and Affrilachian, and you know, figure this out, I'm sure, reading the poems and all the different poets, we think of all the states kind of in Appalachia, but it's also kind of like a space, a spiritual space, right? One that you can't touch. You're just kind of there, kind of thinking about your place with other poets, your place, you know, physically and where you are, like, you know, what city or state you're in. And so, you know, that's always been, you know, it's always been important. So it's funny that by the time I get to University of Kentucky, like, yes, I'm in this group that's focused on place, right? And it just was like, okay, you know, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Okay. Jackie Nelson, right. That question reminds me of a conversation I had today with colleagues regarding the central question: how does our environment shape journey? And I think in particular for you, there's, I think in moving around, you attend to place very, very thoughtfully, but that place always is kind of historicized. There's, you know, how there's a sense of trying to find a tie here, trying to find an anchor in one way or another. Yeah, please.
That's very true. And that's also, I feel like it's kind of my responsibility as a poet, like even moving to Indianapolis. And so many things in my life, it's funny. It's like, I feel like somebody's just kind of like plopping things down in front of me like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And I just kind of take that path. I'm coming out of grad school at IU Bloomington, and I'm reading the Essential Etheridge Night, right? Then I happen to get a job in Indianapolis. So when I'm going to Indianapolis, that means I'm in the city of Etheridge Knight. I'm in the city of Mari Evans, right? So I'm thinking about, how do I navigate this space? What do I bring to this city as, you know, this Black poet coming to the city with this kind of history, you know, there. And of course, you know, my dad wrote about Mari and had that connection and was writing, finishing that book, I think, when I moved here. But, you know, I do think about, because it's like, I don't have to be a poet, right? I can be a poet, but I don't have to publish. I can be a poet and I can be private. But if I'm going to step into this public life of the poet, I need to know who came before me, right? I need to know history. I need to know those poets that were contributing to this space that I'm coming into, you know. And people always think this is funny, but it's just like, Etheridge Knight's sister came to my job talk. We were talking about job talks before, right? So you talk about, I felt like I was getting the blessing. When I came in that space, I was just kind of like blown away. And she ran a festival for Etheridge for many years before she passed. But she was just like, she carried on the legacy, and that was like seeing the legacy of, you know, bringing the legacy of poetry into that space. So I'm always thinking about that.
I follow up with another question. In talking about writers such as Marie Evans and Etheridge Knight, you're really talking about Black arts movement poets, and who are very consciously trying to create a poetry that draws from the language, the music, the culture, the political aspirations of the community, and speak to that community, and do so in a way that is, they think of themselves as public poets. I'll give you a brief example. A distant cousin of mine, Marilyn Nelson, who also writes about history and culture, but she studied with Etheridge Knight at the University of Minnesota. She mentioned what he would do. He would have a poetry workshop, and he said, okay, we're going to go to the McDonald's. He'd take a mic, and they'd, you know, and he was a big man, evidently, and he'd tell the people in the McDonald's, hey, everybody, we're going to have a poetry reading. And he would plug in the mic, and the students would basically kind of line up, and they would read their poetry for the audience. And it seems to me that drawing on a lot of the popular music and traditions of Black music and these other poets, and thinking always about poetic tradition, artistic tradition, that you fit yourself very consciously into a tradition of, when you write, you're very aware of both a Black artistic tradition and the audience to whom you're writing, and how you want to reach that particular audience.
Yeah. And, you know, and again, that's not an accident, because I'm a kid at home in a Black arts movement home, and a home that respected the movement. And so I feel like my father was involved in Black arts movement activities in Louisville, you know, even before I was born. And so living in Iowa, he's constantly putting, you know, me in contact with those things. Like Haki Mahabooty stays in our attic and goes to the writer's workshop at Iowa, you know. So here's this poet living in the house. It looks like another any dude with a fro, looking like my dad. I'm like, who is this guy? You know, find out years later, I'm just like, I cannot believe who was in this house. But, you know, it's like, I was brought up in a house where the art, and, you know, because, you know, the way I'm always thinking about Baraka's essay, like how you sound, you know, so we're sounding like the music, we're sounding like the way that we speak.
Mhm.
You know, we're sounding in a very, you know, kind of a natural, you know, a natural tone of the everyday, you know, everyday language. And we know, you know, the Black Arts Movement, you know, being called that kind of like sister, you know, sister of the Black Power movement, you know, so there's still politics in mind, there's still um, um, social activity and pushing for justice in mind in the art. And so very early for me, like reading, listening to The Last Poets, you know, listening to This Is Madness as a little kid, listen to the, you know, at home, or reading Nikki Giovanni, I'm like, oh, you can be political. That's all I needed. And I don't know how, I mean, I tell people this all the time. I know people are tired of hearing this, but like For Sandra is like one of my favorite poems, but it's the fact that she said what she says in that poem, and this light bulb just went off, and it was like, oh, okay, like I can talk about things, I can address things, I should be addressing things, I have the right to do that. So that's what I grew up, you know, that's what I grew up with.
And I guess one more question, mainly because, I mean, there are poets coming from Louisville, writers can be coming from Louisville, but I think many people where they come from often feel that, oh, well, my life is not the material of art. My community is not the material of art. I can't really write about my family and so on. How did you how did you find a way? I mean, not all poets do or feel interested in doing it, but how did you, in a sense, kind of, it seems to me, free yourself up to think about the material of your life or your community to write about it?
That's a good question. You know, I think that we know a lot of the way that writing works is you find mentors,
Mhm.
and they, you know, you find somebody that knows more than you do, and they help you along that path. And that, for me, that was the Affrilachian Poets, and it happened very naturally. If I'm around other people that are constantly sharing their poetry, we're all sounding different. Now, this is one of the things that for me was important too, is just like we respect, you know,
Okay.
these different voices. You're encouraged to be different. Whereas Crystal Wilkinson and Frank might have a more rural voice. Um, I consider myself like one to. I really was like, I'm bringing the flag for the urban voice, like
Mhm.
as a co-founder of this group. And then, you know, Bernard Clay was coming in from Louisville doing that kind of thing. Joy
Okay.
Priest now from
Okay.
Louisville is doing that kind of thing. But not that it's all the same. Even our urban voices are different, which is, you
Yeah.
know, which is like, this is what happens when you are around people that are helping you, um, really telling you that, like, yeah, go ahead, create, you know, I'm going to help you make that, you know, next step, and I'm going to support that. You get a little, um, you get a little stronger, a little bolder in what you want to create. And it's important, you know, for people that are thinking, you know, we often, even as teachers, we say, write a poem like so-and-so. I'm always
Right.
trying to get my students to write like this Kevin Young poem, like um, Eddie Priest Barbershop and Notary. It's like one of my favorite Kevin Young poems. And so it's like, write a poem. I don't want you to write that poem. I want you to show a change, right, in the
Okay.
speaker. So you're writing a poem about a place someone goes to and they walk in and they're different when they leave. I don't want you to tell me, and this is always the difficult part, I don't want you to tell me they changed. I want you to show me the change, right? That's when students are like, people start pulling their hair out. This is one of those things that's difficult about poems, right? We show people things with image and we expect them to interpret it. We should all have that different voice. After we're modeling poems, we find out, oh, but I have this different story, you know, because me, I'm thinking, how many other Black punk rock kids are writing, you know, that how many of them are writing poems, you know? And it's funny now because it's like, that's not even a big deal. It's like the people I meet, other Black people I meet, you know, now there's Afropunk, you know, and it's funny that Afropunk in the movie is showing like the one Black kid in Iowa City who used to be me. But years later, it was this guy. You know, I'm just like, it's just like the circle. You know, but you find you're like, nobody is saying this in this way. You're like, let me try that.
Okay.
Let me see if that connects, you know? And if you have, hopefully you have that kind of support, you know, around you. It only takes one other friend that's like, yeah, let me read that poem, you know? If you don't have an Affrilachian Poets and, you know, this growing, you know, family, yeah, it just takes one other person.
Could I ask you, and then I'm sure people want you to read, so, but I also, what was your experience at Canem, the, you know, this group, you basically supporting Black writers, Black poets?
I got to work with, I mean, it was ridiculous. Let me say in the best possible way, because it saved my book. After I had a workshop with Yusuf Kumunyaka, I had to work with him twice. I worked with him at a summer writers workshop at IU, and I ended up taking that for credit because this was after he left IU. I went to IU to study with Kevin Young. Kumunyaka was not there, but I got to work with him at Canem, and being in his workshops. If you've ever been to a workshop with Yusuf Kumunyaka, it's hilarious because he just goes, he'll find it's like when he's looking through your poem, it's just like, it's like, no, like musically, this doesn't work. You know, he'll tie in so quickly to the ways that things work on the page and how they sound. He's so in tune to that it's just like, you're probably gonna get out of there early. But you'll be like, yeah, I need to, once I got out of there, I was just like, yeah, I need to revise this book. And it was one of those things where those kind of experiences, meeting, there's so many poets that I met at Canem that right now are just like, you know, just exploding. Some of them, it happened, you know, sooner than others, but I think, you know, just all happens at the right time, you know. But there's so many other, and once you go, it's still a community even after you leave. So yeah, it was a great time.
Oh, great. Do you want to read a couple more poems?
I'm going to read you a few more. I'm going to read you one more maybe from the book. And then I'm going to read you some new poems, newly published poems that haven't got a chance to share too often yet. So this is an Iowa City poem from Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms. And this is kind of another one of those poems I'm trying to figure out place and where I fit in. This would kind of be early Iowa City days for me. This is called Amplified. And it begins with the epigraph, Iowa, Iowa, you have more poets than scarecrows these fuse-lit days. Rain Arroyo. It gets tight sometimes. I'm learning my breath, how deeply to inhale when air goes too far, presses lungs to burst. But nothing moves me like this. Headphones drown out Iowa, the cornfields waving heads of silk across the street, the family who walks barefoot in the snow, who stares through us, no matter the day. Daddy would say we are equal, even better, but something about our shades didn't play, so there was distance. Iowa winners don't play favorites, and I wonder how their feet don't go numb and submit to gravity, send the boy, his mama, and daddy into the steely ice. I wonder if he calls them mama and daddy. Another album, and I forget the people downstairs who only talk with their eyes. My eyes locked in a war of colors, spaceships, platform shoes at full-length furs. No church like Kentucky. Funk is my religion. There are words my 7-year-old ears shouldn't hear. I know this. I don't say them. I just know. And what does it matter with the headphones on and the needle searching the wax? I can't tell you where Oakland is, but I wish somebody would take me. All I know is I want a voice like Glenn's, one you get called on to seep from your lips in a whispered prayer, build to the sky like each stone in a pyramid. I want that sound coming out of me, floating on a microphone, amplified, a crowd glued to every note. Swing down, sweet chariot, stop. More snow will come today. Will the family downstairs wear shoes? Do they hear me sing along in the quiet of my bedroom? No other voice but mine, calling into space, a signal considered a holy vessel, contemplating landing, burning circles in the husk. So I'm going to read a few of these new poems, and just a couple of these. I'm going to start with persimmons. Persimmons are important to Indiana. It's funny, you'll see a meeting, there's a meeting between Kevin Young and I in this poem, and it's subject of persimmon pudding, but this poem goes in many different directions. I should also say that this is probably the only concrete poem I've written, and it's in the shape of a tree. You'll see, this was included in the Furious Flower anthology, and you'll see why it's in the shape of a tree after I read this poem. Persimmons, our state, our comfort, a sweet strange, offered in a pudding by my professor on our first meeting, a cafe on Kirkwood before the start of the semester. Try it, he says. It's a local favorite. I'm not a local, though I've known poems in states with eyes and enough white skin to make my breath anomaly. So I get the gist quick. Campus is oasis. Step outside and its outer limits. I make friends. The only male poet admitted my year. Funny to say now, what stumbling pride for gender. Others follow, including Kentucky ties. I am shocked to hear a friend admitted the year after me is shut down in a workshop over a poem about lynching. Hasn't everything about lynching already been said? Fired a mouth I thought knew better. Have we stopped dying? It's a matter of the pulp and the rendering, how to reap what lies beneath the papery skin, forget the seeds. Years later, the friend says, Mitch, you are a roach. You could live anywhere. Plant, uproot, repeat. I suppose there is truth to this. True that I adapt, survive. How I keep my curiosity on the way to Heartwood. Think of her beaten poem and look up the last Indiana lynching on the books, 1930, Marion, not so long ago, that the memory is smoke. The photographs that survive of the men who didn't, the proud Hoosier as vector pointing skyward, finger and smirk, an arrow over shoulder, as if to say, would you look at that? 3 plump bulbs, ripe in the twine. So I could not end on a poem that heavy. I'm going to end with something a little lighter, and it's a newer poem that's, for some reason, I was watching Jeopardy and Gwendolyn Brooks was a Jeopardy question. This became a tweet. This is our lives now, right? So this is called Poem That Begins with a Tweet about Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks was a Jeopardy question no one could answer tonight. That's a metaphor too painful to wrap my head around. And I said, the poem is about love because all poems are about love. And you rolled your eyes so hard, I thought they would snap back to center with cherries and diamonds. The flit of your lashes renders me nameless, and I fall blank for what feels like a block. Falling is a metaphor for my life, unsettled, unmoored. I capitalize love because it is bigger than what we are, or what we give credit for. Oaken, open. For that, you have no answer. Your breath in kitchenettes, halved, quartered, cut again. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you
so much. I think I do want to invite the listeners to type in chat any questions that you have, comments, things that come to mind, perhaps about the poems themselves, Professor Douglas's experience, teaching, writing, anything of that sort. I did want to ask about voice. That came up, that stood out in Amplify, being in Iowa City, and there's that wonderful line, well, the wonderful, funk is my religion, a voice like Glenn's, I want that sound coming out of me. And the development of a voice, and at times the sense of pressure of developing that voice, the responsibility seems to come up a lot. Even going back to your first volume, why is voice so important, and finding voice so important to you?
I think that's like the lifelong kind of writer issue. Also, when you're a young writer, you're going into a class and somebody's like, we're going to work on finding your voice. Well, you're not going to find it this semester. if you do, like, you're some kind of like miracle, like coming out of the blue, but you're going to work on it, right? You're going to keep working towards it. And a lot of times you're going to change. And I think probably one of the most valuable lessons I learned was taking a persona. I took a long poem class with Kevin Young. It was like one of the last classes he taught at IU. And that's where Cooling Board started. It started as a long poem in that class. And, we're reading all these different, books considered long poems, one of them being Montage of a Dream Deferred. And so listening to Langston Hughes talking all these different voices as one poet was kind of like, that's kind of a light bulb thing. It makes me understand, and we talk about poetic license. It's like we have to be sure that we're telling our students, we're always talking about the speaker, right? Because we don't want them to assume it's an autobiographical work, but also you can be a range of voices in a poem. It's like being a character in fiction, but we don't also, when we talk about poetic license, we don't always, we're not always clear to show them that, you're not, that on the page is not really you. That's a version of you. You say things in that poem that you wouldn't say to people's face, right? You're braver in that poem, or you're just somebody else completely different. Like you just make up a character and talk. I'm trying to be an amplified. I'm thinking about younger me in the first place we lived in Iowa City in this huge apartment complex where I made, friends, and my older brothers' Parliament Funkadelic records were helping me get through that. It's like, it's always about music. Like wherever I go, it's like the music is helping me find that space. But so I'm thinking about who that kid was. I'm trying to talk as that kid, but again, that's kind of going back to that class where I'm just like, okay, you can have many voices, and it's probably better if you do, like, try different voices. Like don't write as the same voice all the time. That's like my greatest fear. Like people are gonna be like, man, he's always sounding the same, or he's always writing the same poem. Like I mean, I am honestly scared of that. That's kind of one of the things that motivates me to keep, like, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now?
Okay.
Yeah, what's going to be the next thing?
Oh, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
We've got two comments.
Yeah.
Karen Chandler writes, and yes, that's my wonderful wife. You've just read a concrete poem. I wondered if music inspires you to structure any of your poems.
Music inspired a form I created for the second book called The Fret. And if you play guitar, even if you don't play guitar, right, you know, like what guitar tablature looks like if you're going to like a magazine and they've got the notes kind of spread out for you, showing you where to put your fingers on the strings. That becomes that's the way they show the notes. I came up with a form that basically looks like the fret of a guitar, or looks like the neck of a guitar. And these are the three frets. And the name of each string is the first letter you see in each line. So I mean, music that's one way that music has made me think about kind of external form, like physically what a poem is going to look like on the page. Because I'm kind of wanting you to read that and think about, it's kind of like a blues, but it's doing something a little bit differently. But you know, it's rooted in the guitar, and the movement. And imagine kind of playing those notes as you're reading the poem. Um, but I'm often um, pretty free in terms of form, and that's kind of like we get in a little bit of trouble when we talk about free verse, because it's not really free. It just means that it hasn't been defined yet, until you do it. But it's I think the fret for me has been one of those times where I went to form. Yeah.
Okay. Jackie Nelson asks, what advice would you give to encourage students to take a risk and write about ordinary things? They think everything has to be extra.
Yeah.
Extra come from ordinary.
That's so difficult, isn't it? Um, that's like the writing. That's always the writing challenge, I think, for beginning students sometimes. For me, talking about their voice is particular. I think sometimes young writers have a power they don't understand that they have, and that goes back to the idea of telling the unique story. And we know the way that you know yep, forgive me for another, like a music analogy, but we know the way that like trends in music works. We see one person do something and everybody's like, now you have a million people that sound like this artist, but we only remember the first one, not the people that came after. So this is not really who you want to be. So as you're, you know, I think that power that you have is, do you speak more than one language? Can it, you know, put Spanish and English in the poem? Where have you lived? Who raised you? Um, and I think for me, and I'm the poet that comes like kind of to mind is taking the mundane and making it magical. I always think of Lee Young Lee in that way. It's like, which is one of the reasons why it doesn't matter what he's written. I've always tried to make a space for him on a poetry syllabus, because it's like there's something magical happening in this domestic scene between these people, and like it looks normal, but it's not. So I think just honoring um, kind of the unique person that they are, there is worth in that. There's worth in who they are, because they are not like everybody else. Um, you know, the point for you deciding that you're going to share your writing is you're thinking like, I have a viewpoint that nobody else has, not I want to sound like, you know, somebody else and do this really crazy big thing that somebody else is doing, you know. This is also, see, students are going to look at this and they're going to know the trick, but the trick is like, you know, it's even more magical if you start from something really mundane and turn it into something that's, you know, it's a bigger leap to magic, because you're like, how did you, like, you know, how did you do that? You know, how does this poem about Lee Young Lee, like writing this poem about these parents flirting, end up being this huge kind of magical thing where we feel like I wasn't even supposed to see that. These people are, you know, these people, it's like a really private moment I was not supposed to see, but you put this in a poem. I'm just like, okay, like, how do I do that? You know, find examples like that too. It's just like when you make that leap, it looks like magic because it's such a huge transition, and they can do it. You know, they can do it too.
That reminds me of another thing that I found very striking in your books of poetry, that I would turn a page and there would be a birth certificate. Or there's one poem in Black Alphabet, which is basically a church program.
Yeah.
And you know, and it was wonderful to see something, and then you rendered it strange and different. It was both something very familiar that many of us have seen program, and be sure to come to our event. And you know, these are the people on the sick and shut-in list.
Yeah.
Sure to. And yet, because it was in a book of poetry, and you handled it very, very well too, it suddenly took on all of these additional meanings. Something that I never in a million years would have thought of as poetic.
Yeah, that was another kind of goal with this book. So this is the first time that I'm introducing my form, the fret, but I'm also playing around with other documents, right? My grandparents, I made these facsimiles of my grandparents' birth certificates, you know, and the one thing that struck me about those, and this is one of them, this would be my grandmother's. And, you know, as you're seeing this, and, you know, there's race as listed as colored, and then, you know, farmer, occupation is farmer and farmer's wife, you know, and, you know, this is my handwriting, by the way. So I'm just like, this is basically this is a reproduction of what the form, you know, the birth certificate looked like, you know, in their year. I wanted to play with all of those things and make you think about, yeah, this could be a poem, you know. The church program was a very personal thing because my grandfather was a deacon in the same church for, you know, most of my life. You know, my grandmother was also part of that same church. And so, you know, she's on the sick and shut in list, you know, and that becomes a conversation for talking about her, her departure. But I just did, somebody just said like the comfort, how comforting of
Jackie.
Jackie.
There's a lot of comfort in the church program.
Yeah, it's, you know, you're getting everybody together, you're celebrating people, you're also telling them like, look, you know, the bus is going to leave you if you don't get here on time. You know, it's just like all those things that really happen. You know, and thinking about all the time I, you know, spent in that church as a kid and growing up and what that meant to my grandparents. And yeah, that had to be in there. So yeah, I spent a lot of time playing with things that we don't normally think were considered, you know, poem. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of another idea that in using these documents like a birth certificate or a death certificate or something like that, or this church document, you're also showing people within institutions. And how they are defined by a larger society, their social place. And, to riff off of what Jackie's saying, on the one hand, a death certificate is classifying you, gender, race, all of these sorts of different things. Whereas, a church document, you're part of the church family.
Mm-hmm.
And this is your place. And but you're also seeing how the machinery runs in a particular way.
Yeah, I do have a poem about the pastor of that church too, him in the middle of a sermon. And yeah, but the idea of, that was, I want you to see who they were, what they were involved in, these institutions, like you said, like the church, especially because this was a part of their lives for so many years. It's like, that's one of those personal things that becomes like, almost like a universal experience in a way. Like you see that somebody's reading that, so like, it reminds you of a church program you've seen, or reminds you of a service you've been to.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that, you've held it in your hand before. You've read names like this. And I hope that's the feeling that people, would get. Like, this reminds me of my grandmother's church. Or this reminds me of, where my uncle was. That they make that connection.
Was that the poem that began with an epigraph by James Weldon Johnson from God's Trombones? That may be a different poem.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of your poems that alluded to James Weldon Johnson's volume of poems from the 1920s, God's Trombones, in which there's 7 folk sermons, in which Johnson, in trying to capture something of Black culture, but he didn't want to use dialect, used sort of the rhythms and the imagery of the preacher. And it may not be that particular poem, but it did remind me of your ideas about language,
Mm-hmm.
language to use in a poem. And that tends to be big in, not only the African-American poetic tradition, but often there's a self-consciousness into what language you use and how you use it, and how you're expressing a particular person's perspective if you're from a different class, position, so on and so forth. How do you think about language and the language you choose, the words you choose?
I think, our challenge is that we're working, in text, and not working, for the most part, not working in a visual medium. So it's like art can't be the thing that shows you, like, spices this up for you. It's like, it's kind of like, I'm not giving you an actual picture with the poem. I've got to do the job and create the picture, right,
Okay.
with the text. So I just feel like the language is another layer of that. If you're conscious of, your diction and sounding very particular on the page. And I think even Achebe said this at points where, it's like, you might have these different characters. They're not, even if they're from some same, if you read, like, Achebe work, it's like, even if these people are from the same place, they don't talk the same. They've got to stand out on the page so we can know who's who, right? And that's always becomes this issue of, I need to stand out in a way where you can hear or you can see this person, whoever this voice is. And so that becomes another layer for me of, something that has to be in a poem. I'm thinking sometimes, even as, like, characters, and that might be kind of like more of how we think about fiction. But I think when you're thinking about, your diction and creating this character on the page that's going to come off the page, make them larger than life, and that's important. Like you've got to do that. Then you got to start thinking about, well, how do I sound?
Mm-hmm.
I've been through this Bermuda Triangle of the Midwest. What does my voice sound like? You know, it's all mixed up,
Yeah.
right? It's all garbled up.
Yeah.
I use that. That's part of it. You know, maybe my slang is all, you know, messed up because I'm older now. Of course, my slang is just like, yeah, like don't say that. I had this conversation with my daughter the other day. It's kind of like stuff you say in a text you're not really supposed to say out loud. And I was just like,
Okay.
yes, like you know that she's thinking about this at 12. Like I love, you know, we have the best conversations, but you know, and we're laughing about this. Like, yeah, it's not something you actually will say out loud. You sound like a fool if, if you're saying this text language to people. It's like, yeah, you know, but you got to, you know, you think about all of that. You know, how does that go into creating this person that is three-dimensional in this, you know, flat medium, right?
Okay.
So you have a challenge. That's a pretty big challenge.
Well, one thing that stands out in terms of your mobility, your movement and your exposure to different people, different regions, different, you know, it always reminds me of somebody like, well, Henry James, or, you know, somebody who, you know, sort of straddles cultures and being always a little bit on the outside, but accordingly being able to look at a distance. That accent is different. The way that person says this word is different in this particular way. And that's what, at least, is coming to me in terms of your talking about your lived experience. Moving from one region and you get used to it, and then suddenly
all of a sudden. And that, you know, and if you see that as an advantage, you can add that to your, you know, you add that to your writing. It's just like, how do you get this mixed up Southern Midwestern like voice? Like how do you do that? You know, and you're figuring that part out. I'm kind of, you know, I've been in the Midwest now since, you know, been in Indiana since 2003 now. You know, from grad school to working. And so I had to start thinking about, you know, what's happening in the Midwest, you know, and I think about, well, that's where I started writing poetry. I started writing poetry in Iowa. Do I owe some kind of debt, you know, to this place? What more can I say about the Midwest? Yeah. So that kind of comes into the, in Dying in the Scarecrow's Arms a little bit more, thinking more about the Midwest voice, but it's, that consideration is always there.
And I do want to invite people to write. You don't be afraid. I mean, you know, my students are more than happy to have me stop talking, ask questions. I mean, really. Well, let me ask another question, which is, sometimes there's so much focus on a persona. How do you convey community? How do you convey, or at least a culture that lies behind an individual? Because a lot of your poems are incredibly rich. You not only get a sense of a sensibility, but a sensibility in a place, a time, musical language. There's so much religion, all of these things. How do you give a sense of place in poetry?
I think even part of my process, and I did this with Cooling Board, right, is that I want to, and I'm going to be doing this with projects I'm working on, these new projects I'm working on, but I like to immerse myself. Actually, I like to write in that place if I'm writing about somebody. That's one of the things. I want to bring some of that personality of that place to that person, but I also want to spend some time writing in that place. I feel like Cooling Board is what it is because I was writing in St. Louis, you know. So I'm walking in the same neighborhoods that Donnie lived in. The church where his funeral is at, unfortunately, is no longer there. The one where, you know, Stevie Wonder sang and all these stars were there at his funeral, like that church is gone. But staying in St. Louis and writing in St. Louis, you know, was what I needed to, you know, bring this place out. That's the kind of same thing that's happening in that circle poem. That's one of those poems where, you know, I'm trying to get a sense of what is the heart of this city like, and to, you know, I started taking my students to the circle and writing on the circle. That's part of a class I was teaching about writing about place, where we would go to different sites in the city and write and observe it, you know, record, you know, what we saw and transform it with poetry. So that immersion, that creative immersion for me is part of the process, and getting that. I want to attempt to write what this place is like, and being there, and what that person, you know, how it feels for that person. And get a little bit closer to them. And that's not always, you know, my process, but I do, when I can spend more time writing in that space, I feel like it does, you know, help the writing. So it's kind of like my process is, I might travel somewhere to research, and I'm going to stay there and write too. You know,
Okay.
There's the digging, and then there's the creation after. Yeah. And that definitely was a part of the first book, the Donny Hathaway book.
Well, may I ask you, and not to curse you in any way?
I know what this question is. Okay.
Well, what projects are you working on?
See, I knew that. That was a curse.
You can always say, keep it under wraps. But...
So this is the thing. It's changed quite a bit, but I'm really, this is one of those things, again, where I'm pushing myself in terms of innovation. I'm going to do some surprising things, some things I'm starting to wonder, like, you know, like, are you sure you want to do this?
Okay.
But it seems to be working so far. But what I'm doing is I'm working on pretty, you're probably going to see some, the National Endowment for the Arts, actually fellowship, is going to help me work on multiple projects, right? So it's not just going to be one thing, but the big thing is going to be a kind of a poem or a book about 3 artists, one of them being from Louisville, and it's kind of like tying these lives, you know, together in poetry in a very different way. And I say different because, you know, like, I've done persona before, and so I'm consciously thinking about going back to that, not wanting to be the guy that does the same thing all the time. It's like, I've done persona, now how can I do this in a different way? And I think I've figured it out. It's just going to be like ridiculously complicated.
Okay.
But it's going to be, you know, but actually doing it, and I'll start, you know, research pretty soon. But it's or the travel for the research, I should say, because the research has already started. But it's one of those things I'm really excited about, and I think when I make it work, and I think when people see it, they'll be, I think they'll be pleased. You know, especially, you know, again with the Louisville, the Louisville person I'm pulling into it is not going to be an obvious person, so that will be a kind of a surprise for people too. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's great. I did want to mention, you had mentioned her name before, the poet Joy Priest, who also is from Louisville, and also received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. And I think her book of poetry, Horsepower, was published, I think, was it last year, 2 years ago?
Not sure.
By the University of Pittsburgh Press. You know, discovering that she grew up in the neighborhood right near Churchill Down. And so I wanted to mention her, but that leads to maybe my final question, which is, and I keep eyeing the chat, you know, you are welcome to ask some.
Yes.
But what books are you reading, or recent books do you recommend?
Joy's book is in that stack. Definitely. I came back to Louisville and kind of loaded up at Carmichael's on some good stuff. But Michelani Bandele, another poet from Louisville, another Affrilachian poet from Louisville, has a has a new book out that focuses on Bud Powell. Now you think I'm into music, but these are poems in doing some, thinking about jazz. So we think about, other poets that are, other poets in Kentucky in the area that are doing really good things. Let me see who else, because I've got this crazy stack of books. Erica Foreman, Detroit poet, Salt Body Shimmer, newer book that's really good. Destiny Birdsong, poet in Nashville, got a really, this is kind of her, I think full-length poetry debut, but she's got some other like essays and some other things planned as well. So there's just so many like really good things happening right now. I have this like my own homework. Honoré Fanon Jeffers had the Phyllis Wheatley, book, that was another, she's been working on for a long time. So she's one of these poets a lot, that's putting in the work of, the historical research, getting to take the next step, like, Marilyn Nelson, who you mentioned, earlier with, the way that she wrote about Carver. She's one of those poets that's doing that kind of, deep research to set up a, poetic narrative about somebody that we really, that we've never quite seen this way in poems, in this, kind of depth of, story with poems in a full collection like this.
There is a question. Thank you. Can you give some example of the ways in which you research for poems? What would you tell young people about preparing to write a poem from the perspective of persona? So maybe that's two questions. The first is, how do you research for poems depending upon the subject matter? And then we can take the second one right after that.
Yeah, I have a background in newspapers, so I'm kind of used to doing this digging and looking for answers, which also kind of helps, in the academic world as well. But when I think, sometimes we went through this very natural kind of phase in Black poetry of writing persona books. So my research in terms of poetry kind of started with wanting to create a persona. Now it's just, continued in my own interest of wanting to write about historical figures, in terms of poems. So I think, for me, it's, kind of finding where the most reliable sources of information are about this person. It always starts, online, but then you find who's got the papers here, or there, wherever, and you kind of do a little bit, more digging into to it that way. I've always thought about persona in the sense of, if I'm going to speak as this person, and again, I feel like this kind of period of persona for African-American poets was very natural. It was Cornelius Eady's Brutal Imagination and Tyehimba Jess's Lead Belly and Frank X. Walker's York poems, and like nobody said we're all going to do these persona poems at the same time.
Yeah,
it just kind of happened, that way. That's the way that it happened. So I think it was a very kind of beautiful, natural thing. But as I, was reading, as I said before, reading Langston Hughes and seeing him try on all these voices, my thing was that if I'm going to write as somebody else, I want somebody to say, that sounds like them, like that sounds like what they were going to say. So to give yourself the permission to write as someone else, the research becomes the big part of that, and so that's why for me with Donnie, it was spending time in St. Louis, it was talking to family members, it was talking to friends, it was going to the high school, high school used to be in the new version, and walking through the neighborhoods, and it was all those things. So research is different things, right? It's, it's not just the books and the online searches, through it's, the reporter in me wants to be in the place, right?
Okay.
It's still there. Like, I want to get out and walk the neighborhood and get
Mhm.
a sense of that, And so that's how, as an artist, I get to give myself permission to write as that person. But I also feel like that's just going to make a better poem. I get to be in the same city as the person I'm talking about
Yeah.
and see the houses that they lived in, you know,
Mhm.
that's going to help me. Talking to Donnie's sister, Jacqueline Bethany, saying sometimes it felt like he was playing for a note he couldn't reach.
Mhm.
It's just like, yeah,
Wow.
and I'm having the same reaction, like, really?
Yeah.
That's a poem, and you
Yes.
start working on that stuff. I mean, that's the way, it's just, it's a really rewarding process. And when stuff like that happens, you realize, like, oh yeah, I need to be out here talking to people. It's not
Mhm.
just on the computer, So you do kind of have a little bit of that. It's the curiosity just keeps you going. You have to stay curious.
One thing that connects to a lot of African American poetry that is written about history is very self-aware that it is constructing. That, in other words, that there are these gaps that can't be fulfilled. You mentioned, circles with an epigraph from Robert Hayden, and Robert Hayden is almost this poet par excellence of writing about history and bringing pieces together. But there's a sense of it kind of spliced together in a poem like Middle Passage, in which on all of these records of slave voyages and historical testimony and so on. But there's also a sense in which it's very much spliced together. And the poet is very active because there's a sense so much is missing, so much needs to be imagined or created, that sense. And I wondered, is there a sense of that in your own poetry, or at least, providing something that is missing or filling in one way or another?
That's that part of the imagination. I had been calling it informed imagination, and this is
Yeah.
this idea of, I'm going to research, I'm going to find out, what would have been the next step, or can I kind of picture what that would be. And I think that's our curiosity with a lot of these, people from history, is like, we don't know everything, but we also, we wonder sometimes about the little things,
Yeah.
and filling in those gaps of the story. And that's another way the research comes in. It helps you, based on what you've read about what they've done here, you can imagine how they might, interact with this person, or start this thing, or and so that does, really become a part of, what we do, as well. I think it's, we're that the idea of filling in the gaps, making maybe a more complete, portrait of this person, and imagining, all the things that they're capable of, and
Yeah.
could do. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn it back over to the Jeffersonville Library, but it was a great honor and
Well,
privilege.
I'm glad we got to meet. Of course, we'll be talking a lot.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, this is
And
the beginning.
please tell your father hello,
I
because
will definitely do that. My dad will be so pleased
oh,
about this. But thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
well, thank you. And, I think a lot of people are saying it's been a pleasure and so on. And Diane Stepro is the person who wrote the grant and made these programs possible. And well, she's unmuted, so I will mute myself and let her take over.
Yeah.
Wanted to thank Mitchell and David both for this wonderful conversation, and thank everyone for coming, and thank the Library of America for the generous funding that has allowed us to present this program. And I hope you all have a safe evening and stay warm.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You all take care. Thank you.
Wow. So, thank you, David. You're muted, but and you don't know how to unmute it, and I don't either. So I'll see you soon. I guess I'll hit end. Allison's gone, so I guess the recording's done. So.